Hello, Peter.
Greetings.
You've been Castlemaine Art Director for quite some time.
38 years altogether. It's a long time.
It is. And you've been the longest...
I now have this honour of being the longest serving public gallery director in Australia in the one institution.
Where did your interest in art begin?
As a student, I suppose, I had more an interest in the collecting. I have an identical twin brother who had more an artistic ability than I did. But we, as students from school and when we were at art school, we collected artworks and together, just more out of self-interest and learning more about the principally Australian artists. And it sort of stemmed from there that we built up a collection. And in 1974, I had an exhibition of the John and Peter Perry art collection at the Castlemaine Art Gallery. And at that time, the director, Bess Sinclair, was so impressed with the display as well as the catalogue I'd produced and the promotion of it that, she was thinking of retiring and she offered me the position following on from that exhibition.
And what has your job entailed?
Today, or any regional gallery director's job in a public gallery entails multitasking in many respects. It's not like a state gallery director, but you have to deal with funding and principally the artistic program, as well as formulating policies, acquisition policies, collection policies, conservation, and looking after the staff who work in the institution, and acquiring as one of the key factors. One of the mission statement I formulated way back in the late 70s was to collect, conserve and communicate Australian visual arts and items of historical interest for the district. So, it's been collecting as well as doing research on the collection, which is both the gallery director's job as well as the curator's job to research a collection for the public program that we put on.
What's been your favourite part of the work?
Certainly the organisation of exhibitions of artists that I believe who have been neglected in Australian art history, doing the initial research and working with our curator to make that happen, organising the loans, dealing with private collections who are willing to lend for the exhibitions. I think that's been an exciting part, but also chasing works for the permanent collection that I think are of a high enough standard, either through auction or private treaty sales or through the commercial gallery arena. That's the fun part. The not so fun part of dealing with boards of management and dealing with minutes and subcommittees. But on the whole, I've had a very good board of management, which has been stable and, generally been quite supportive of where I've been trying to lead the gallery and museum over the years.
Have you had the freedom you wanted?
I have. I've been lucky in the sense that Castlemaine Art Gallery is an independent, private trustee-owned gallery, and I've had that ability to have make decisions on my own back without local government, which most of the regional galleries in Victoria are controlled by local government, where the directors answerable to the city fathers. But I've had more an open reign, which has been terrific, and that's why I've lasted this length of time for 38 years, as having that freedom, I suppose, to pursue the direction that I wanted the gallery to go in.
When did you start?
I started on the 1st of July 1975. That was my official start date. And I was at that stage the youngest appointed to a public gallery in Australia. I was only 23, which was heard of at that time. But and I knew very little about management and structures of finances and budgets, but soon learned those on the job, I suppose, as I threw a lot of my energy in those early years into more the public program of the exhibitions, where we focused a lot more local exhibitions at that time, because there wasn't the funds to mount larger exhibitions in the earlier days, so we relied more on local-based exhibitions.
What were some of those?
Well, we used to have, in the middle 70s, there were a lot more ceramic exhibitions happening, from my recall. We had local printmakers showing, and also more photography exhibitions that were held by photographers in the region, but also Melbourne or interstate as well. And the program was, I suppose, just as diverse as it is today, but there was a local component with a selling exhibition involved generally all the time as well, where the gallery took a small commission on sales. And in those days, artworks weren't as dear to buy as they are today. And yeah, it was a different arena, and there was embraced by the local community a lot more. But also there was more craft work at that time from the 70s, as I said, particularly ceramics, both functional and non-functional. And yeah, there was a lot of energy happening at that time.
Interesting that you mentioned functional and non-functional, because during that period of time there was a lot of discussion about between the arts and the crafts.
Okay, there were two different, with the federal government, they had a separate crafts board and a visual arts board. And public galleries were collecting in both areas, even though the definition of fine arts stuck to principally painting, sculpture, and it did embrace photography and printmaking. But the crafts had a lot more profile than it does today. But because of, I think, rising costs and cheaper imports, particularly for ceramics, it's killed a lot of the craft work that was taking place in that 60s and 70s period.
A lot of that was functional, but there was a turning point where it became more art.
Yes, it was. There were ceramists who had formal training in the various institutions that went away from the functional to produce their own forms as individual works of art, and some reached high acclaim for the pieces they produced, whether it was in the form or the glaze or the originality of the way ceramics were produced. And that was an important period, and particularly in the 70s, particularly the late 70s and early 80s, where there was a lot more non-functional ceramics as sculptural pieces on their own. They had a lasting contribution, and galleries did, and Castlemaine collected a few, not many, but a lot of the other public galleries collected as well in that area.
Did you see some innovative work?
Yes, I did. Up here I saw some what I call stock standard, predictable work. Some of it was quite decorative and appealing commercially, but there were a few that stood out for producing what I think was above the rank of the average craftsperson, that people either worked at it and had some success, and either some drifted away from what they were doing. But there were one or two, particularly in central Victoria, which encompassed Bendigo, and there are still a few working today that are still producing good original work, but there is also a lot of what I deem commercial work that hasn't that's got technical proficiency but hasn't got the quality to make it into a public art museum.
Would you say that's one of the mediums that has changed during your time more than perhaps some of the others?
Yes, it is. I think I've seen over those 38 years changes in different mediums take place, and basically within the fine arts of painting, sculpture, printmaking and photography, even though digital photography's come into being in recent years. The other areas of ceramics, particularly in fibre and textiles, has changed over the years, and there were peaks and troughs, I suppose, that I can see that have taken place, but painting still remains a medium with its oil on canvas or whatever, and refinement has been marked in recent times in that area to producing some outstanding work. But compared with the earlier work that was tended to be more what I call rougher and more rustic, I suppose, but that was what people were looking for at that time. But in more recent years, well, the last 20 years anyway, there's been a greater refinement in the visual arts particularly.
Let's have a look at some of these pots and talk about the potters.
We've got, or have had over a long period of time, a number of very successful ceramists who have produced some great pottery over the years. Two in particular that we've got well represented in our permanent collection is Barry Singleton with this cluster of works here, and Anne Giroux, who is another fine potter who celebrates her 80th year next year, and the gallery are mounting a major show of her work. But Barry, who had his first exhibition in the gallery in 1970, has been potting in this district for over 40 years and still producing some wonderful work.
And he had an exhibition just recently.
Yes, as part of the Castlemaine State Festival, he had a major retrospective of works encompassing his whole 40 years of his ceramic history.
Each of these pieces are quite different.
They are, Catherine, yes. They're showing different developments. He went to Japan and was influenced by a couple of the great Japanese masters, came back to Castlemaine and perfected his glazing and his forms, and went from there. But they show a 40-year sort of range of his styles and techniques.
What about the influences that Anne had?
Anne had been to London and studied Chinese ceramics at the Percival David Foundation in London, at the University of London, and was greatly influenced by Chinese glazes and the forms, the Saladin glaze, which is a classic Chinese glaze, as well as the red oxblood glaze, which she looked at in London and brought back and used the similar types of forms with her shapes, as well as these high finish glazes on very fine porcelain, which she used more than earthenware or stoneware.
Of all the exhibitions you've shown here, what would you say was your favourite?
Good question. I've had many, when I've lost count of the number of exhibitions I've mounted. Bear in mind we roughly do 8 to 10 exhibitions a year, but one of my favourite was called Aspects of France, that was organised for a Castlemaine State Festival, where I borrowed Australian paintings of images of France by some well-known Australian artists from the earlier times of the late 19th century to the present day. That's one that stands out. A Russell Drysdale exhibition I mounted in the late 70s, where I borrowed works from state galleries as well as private collections. There's been many, I have to say, over the years, but some of the women artists who have been neglected, I've been particularly proud of trying to give them some recognition following their death. where they've fallen into neglect by either art historians or the general public. And it's always been pleasing to see renewed interest in an artist's work who during their day were regarded, but after their death have fallen into decline.
Are there any local ones in that?
Yes, well, one I did a publication 2 years ago on Amy Bale, who lived in Castlemaine for part of her life, and she died in 1955. And she fell into neglect, and having written a book about her, and her work is now starting to be better appreciated. There have been a number of other artists, Elsie Barlow, a range of different people that I've promoted over the years. But she's one as a local who I felt strongly that she needed a better recognition. But she lived here for nearly half of her life anyway.
Would you like to talk about your publications?
Well, the first one I did, I've done 3 hard-covered publications over the years. The first one, and it's got an interesting anecdotal because it was my first book in 1986, and that was on the watercolour artist R.W. Sturgis, who was one of Victoria's finest watercolour artists. He died in 1932. It just so happened the former director, Bess Sinclair, was the only daughter of R.W. Sturgis, and she got me to write the book on her father, and we did it as an edition of 1,500 copies, and that's sold out back in 1986. That was my first hard-covered book. And 10 years later, in 1996, I produced with my twin brother John Perry a book called Max Meldrum and Associates, Their Art, Lives and Influences. And we'd always believed that Max Meldrum was one of Australia's most underrated painters. He also died in 1955, but during his heyday in the 1920s and 30s, he was regarded as one of Australia's most important artists. And I went to Scotland, where he was born in Edinburgh, and researched his early life and put a publication together with my brother, who concentrated on Max Meldrum's pupils like Clarice Beckett and Percy Leeson and a number of others. And we published that with funds that I obtained in America. And my last book was on Amy Bale 2 years ago. They are the 3 that I've produced.
And many catalogues.
Many catalogues over the years where we have done original research in the catalogues, but I've lost count on that number, yeah.
Now, you were in London in 83, I think, for the V&A.
Yes, I had a spell over there to get some further professional training. I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum under Sir Roy Strong, who was director, an eminent gallery director, and a colourful character, and he supported me as an Australian, gaining further experience. I worked in the exhibition department, working on a major exhibition of miniature paintings, and that was a great insight into a larger institution mounting a major exhibition, and I gained some benefit from just working in a collegial way with colleagues from the Victorian Albert to see such a large museum. But to come back to Australia and to Castlemaine, it was a bit of a shock, because I knew I couldn't put into practice, because of lack of revenue and funds, what I'd worked at in London, but it still gave me great experience and aspirations to work harder at what we're doing with our limited resources.
Do you have a favourite medium?
I've collected drawings, Australian drawings, but I alternate between easel paintings or oil paintings and Australian drawings by whether it's pencil, charcoal or Conte. I've collected those, and I do collect Australian sculptures as well. But it's not necessarily a favourite. I just like the mediums, but I like more the subject matter, what the artist has done with the using the different mediums, and responded aesthetically to what my heart feels that I think is a good work of art, basically. And it's been over my years training my eyes to look at the visual world and look at things in an artistic way. And yeah, some come off better than others, but the ones I have collected, I suppose there's been quite a number of drawings, but also oil paintings as well. Well, this is a great iconic work of that, what I call the golden period of Australian art, a painting by the father of Australian landscape painting, Tom Roberts. And it was a painting, its title is Reconciliation, painted out at Box Hill in 1886. Poor old Tom Roberts, though, unfortunately couldn't find a buyer for the work and had it in his studio for most of his life, and he gave it to the Castlemaine Art Gallery a year before he died. He presented it in 1930 when the gallery building was being built, but he died up at Olinda in 1931. But it's a great early work of Tom Roberts at Box Hill and shows the eucalypt and the two, very much a Victorian narrative reconciliation of the argument, and now they're getting together again. The companion painting is in the Art Gallery at Ballarat called A Summer Morning's Tiff, which shows the girl off in the bush by herself, and this is a storytelling reconciliation. And yeah, it's a true icon of the Impressionist period.
What makes art stand the test of time?
That's a very difficult question to answer, but one thing I think is that it's not to do with fashion. Art movements come and go, but a work of art that's going to stand the test of time, it has to have some quality, aesthetic quality, whether it be a figurative item or a non-figurative item. It has to have that quality that's hard to actually define. Works that are in museums all around the world that are permanently on the gallery wall, they're works that obviously have stood the test of time, but not because of a storyline, a narrative, or particularly the subject matter, but something that stands apart in an artist's oeuvre. They just stand out. It's not necessarily the presentation either, even though I've always maintained good presentation in a work of art is critical to enhance the artwork. But it has to have balance, harmony of colour, if it's a two-dimensional work, all those characteristic, good composition, paint handling, all those things that make up a good work of art. But it's a very hard thing to define.
Because part of that measuring tool would be your emotions.
Yeah, there is emotional response, and if you don't get it first off when you first respond to a work of art, some take longer and take more reflective of thought over the years when you initially respond to a work, but you can get initial emotional response, but after a period of time you mightn't have that. But some take longer to respond to. They might be quieter in tone or colour, whereas bright colour generally gets a response first off. The Impressionists are always a popular favourite, and the response you get initially is one of an appealing sense, but there are other works that can be more subtle in arrangement and treatment that take a little bit longer, and they can be equally last as long. But it's the eye looking at the object and according to the brain you respond to that, and it stays with you or it doesn't.
You mentioned the Impressionists. You have a large Impressionist collection.
Of our Australian collection, yes. We've had, because the gallery was founded 100 years ago this year in 2013, a number of the key works of the Impressionist school, or the golden period of Australian landscape painting, of people like Tom Robertson, McCubbin and Streeton, and the Edwardian painters of Philip Fox, who I think is closest to the French Impressionist school than any of the others. We collected those works at that time, and we're lucky we did because they were a little bit out of favour at that time as well. But we're lucky to have a strong collection, and that's partly why the public come to Castlemaine to look at that collection. Another major work in the gallery's collection is the next period, or the Edwardian period, is this work by Philip Fox, E. Philip Fox, one of the great, really true Impressionist painters, looked at the French school. It's called The Bathing Hour, and depicts the female sitter in this work was the wife of Penley Boyd. Ethel Anderson is her name. It was purchased by the gallery in 1952 after Ethel Carrick Fox, his wife, passed away, and this came up at auction, and the gallery were lucky enough to acquire it when these Edwardian painters were out of favour, and it's regarded as a major Impressionist painting of this period, painted in about 1909, based on sketches at Chelsea Beach, and it's regarded as a great Impressionist painting by E. Philip Fox.
What have you got over here?
Well, we have a great painting by an interesting donor, and this painting by Fred McCubbin was painted in 1914, and its title is Golden Sunlight. Fred McCubbin painted this 3 years before he died, and Dame Nellie Melba presented it to the gallery in 1923, and it's when McCubbin was influenced, one trip abroad to England where he was influenced by J.M.W. Turner's more painterly paintings, and he used a palette knife. It depicts the Yarra River from South Yarra looking towards the city skyline. But Melba, in presenting this in 1923, she had bought it directly off McCubbin, and we're delighted to have it. It's been in the gallery's collection ever since, and it's a great later period of McCubbin's work.
What was that period called?
It was the Edwardian period, even though it was part of the Australian golden period. Tom Roberts, Streeton, McCubbin, Conda, Jane Sutherland and others were painting from the 1880s up to around the First World War. This was just painted just at the start of the First World War. But he lived till 1917, but other painters like Streeton lived till 1942. But it's that period. There's no direct cut-off point, but it's around that 1900 to 1914 period when they're producing this sort of work.
What about your relationship with Stuart Stoneman?
It was a long one. Stuart Stoneman was my chairman of trustees for nearly 30 years, and I became his art advisor for 18 years because he had the finances to buy works of art. And he didn't like the commercial dealing of going to dealers so much. He put his trust in myself and my brother, and we often bought through private treaty sales and at auction for his private art collection. He was a most difficult person to deal with at times, yet he'd be generous in the same breath. Complex character, and the more I think about his legacy has been a good one for Central Victoria, but there are many occasions where I ran into conflict with some of his ideas. But I became his advisor, and were able to buy what I think is a substantial collection for his holdings. Yeah.
Yes, it's a fairly strong feeling that he was very supportive of artists locally.
Yes, he was. In the early days, particularly when he was living in Castlemaine, he'd always support the local artists. If there was an exhibition on, people knew he had the finances to buy, but he was one businessman in Castlemaine who did actually support the local artists, and whatever that medium, whether it was sculpture or ceramics or paintings or drawings, he always bought them, not only to help the artist but also to give that encouragement and support. So that was a positive thing.
Mm. And this has got a museum as well as an art gallery. Do you want to just talk briefly about the museum?
Yeah, the museum collection has had a focus of historical items pertaining to what we now call the Mount Alexander Shire. And I took it upon myself in my early years to establish a direction where I wanted to collect as much historical material on the goldfields from the 1850s onwards. And I endeavoured over the years to build up a collection of historical artworks, principally engravings of Castlemaine and district from the 1850s right through to the 1880s and 1890s, to show the public what this great centre was like from the goldfields onwards. And I've built up quite a strong holding through acquisitions, gifts, donations, a large body of historical artworks, more than anything else, as well as early photographic work pertaining to some of the early photographers who are here in Castlemaine in the 1860s, where I was lucky enough in Gippsland to acquire a collection of 14 early photographs of Castlemaine. So that has been, and it's given the museum a clear focus of where we're heading, more than just collecting an eclectic mix of different things for the museum.
Memorable events?
Geez, I can think of quite a few. I think one memorable event was when we launched our Russell Drysdale exhibition to an absolutely packed in like sardines opening, where I'd got Lady Drysdale, Russell Drysdale's widow, to come down from New South Wales to open the exhibition, and our president at the time, a real estate agent, Max Cassidy, gave a glowing welcome to the packed audience, and I think I introduced Lady Drysdale, and all she said was, "Thank you for inviting me to open this exhibition of my husband's work. I declare it open," and that was it. So that was the shortest opening remarks I've ever heard, but it did cause quite a lot of excitement because of the nature of the artist Russell Drysdale's work. I've had some wonderful events during the state festival. I've had the French ambassador up, where we had French champagne and Bordeaux wines at a luncheon function at the gallery. I've had many late nights of openings where they've gone on, where I've had to keep ringing security to say that we won't be turning the security system on until later that night. But memorable ones where I think it's been, overall, have been positive when the artist, the living artists who have seen their work in a solo exhibition, either in a survey or retrospective, the joy of seeing their response to their work being brought together for the first time, that's been to me, a pleasurable experience, knowing that the artist has appreciated the work that the gallery has done in giving them that profile and supporting them with a major exhibition.
It is a beautiful gallery with the natural light.
Yeah, the gallery is unique to have this very good light, where artists over the years have always commented to me and the staff about how good the daylight is. And 12 years ago we had the roof re-roofed in a special glass to continue on with using natural daylight, where the glass is a special glass with an ultraviolet filter through it to stop the UV light damaging any of the artworks. And we've been able to maintain that natural daylight over the years, and it's been a plus, I think.
What do you think makes an artist successful?
I believe to be a successful artist, I really think it's based on blood, sweat and tears. It's a lot of hard work and commitment. I know with the present exhibition of Rick Amore's work, an artist mid-career, he's had to work at it over tough times as well as now successful times, but he's had that commitment. And I think a visual artist is often an isolated person who needs to work in his studio. He can have music or other things that might stimulate when he's working, but I think it's a lot of hard work, and also having the right agent or dealer handling that work and having a good relationship with he or her dealer. But on the whole, it's a matter of having the perceptions to start off with, but it's basically hard work.
What actually brought you to Castlemaine?
I used to come down as a student when I was training to be an art teacher in Bendigo in the early 70s. I'd been from school, I'd been to art school, and then was doing teacher training to be an art teacher. And I used to come down in breaks from lectures down to the Castlemaine Art Gallery. I'd come originally from Melbourne, so Castlemaine was new to me at that time. And I was attracted more so than Bendigo Art Gallery to Castlemaine's unified collection of Australian art that meant a lot to me. And it was that relationship I had in meeting the first director, Bess Sinclair, as a student, and she encouraged me as one mentor to show that interest in the visual arts and in looking at displays, the aesthetics of hangs in a public gallery and putting it into some sort of chronological context. So that's why I was attracted to Castlemaine.
How would you describe Castlemaine then?
Then it was a different community than what we see today, almost 40 years later. It was a community that I think is unique in the sense that had many people that had moved out of Melbourne in the 60s, and I call it a hippie generation, or alternate types who had bought miners' cottages at Chewton and Castlemaine and surrounds, where they liked that lifestyle and the more openness about it. And the local community, even at those early days, I believe, embraced that broader alternate community down the street and in the retail sections, and they got a fair go compared with what I believe other communities that might have been more suspicious of an alternative lifestyle. But it's been going on for that length of time, and yeah, it's been the community here, I think, is far more broad-minded for a country town in central Victoria than many other country towns with similar populations. It's just embraced the arts, has done for a long time. its proximity to Melbourne. But yeah, I think the diversity of lifestyles, and that's been a factor that I've felt has been a really positive thing.
So this is where you keep your treasures?
Yes, it's our storage area for the oil paintings, watercolours, prints, drawings, sculptures and ceramics. Yeah, great space for storage of the works that aren't on display.
And here we have Paul Cavell.
Yes, Paul Cavell came to Castlemaine in the mid-80s and produced a strong body of work of that period. This painting, watercolour and gouache, is called Castlemaine Domestic, and we acquired it in the mid-90s. It's a terrific work and represents him very well, I believe.
Tell me about what's happening in here.
In the composition, he's incorporated various architectural features, the Castlemaine Post Office, and a lot of the old iron from the mining era that was scattered around his property, together with some of the more domestic things in his own life and local house situation. And yeah, it's just a lot of movement and colour in this painting.
Mm. And behind me is one of my own photographs, which the gallery purchased.
That was a work from your exhibition called Characters of Castlemaine, and it's a terrific photograph of a local identity and the gallery's former chairman of trustees, Stuart Stoneman, who had a chain store of supermarkets in this area. And it depicts Stoneman as a successful businessman and a philanthropist in his own right, who supported many local artists from the 60s right through to his passing. It's great work.
I took that photograph in the room above Stoneman's book room, looking out across to the market building.
Yeah, he had various offices and properties in Castlemaine itself, and was quite supportive of the artist's use of spaces that he had. Yeah, it was a good thing.
Can we just talk about some of those artists from the 60s, some of those hippies and artists?
Yeah. No, well, there was, I think the police used to turn a blind eye. There was much marijuana smoking at the parties that I used to go to in those that middle 70s period. It was all not necessarily free love, but it was more embracing the nature and the environment. There was cheap plonk, and it was just a different feel where the artists, and I think of Laurie Turner and Bob Johnson and Jim Rowe and David and Peter Wallace, quite a list of them, Juliana Hilton. I'm not saying they're all in that category, but they all had left Melbourne for a different lifestyle, and they embraced it. And they were the earlier pioneers. I came in during the middle course, but I could see that their lifestyle didn't quite fit the conventions of the working class in Castlemaine, but they were embraced by the locals. Not all the time, but they had something unique about them, whether it was their dress or the length of their hair, or their alternate outlook, or holding forth in the local pub. They, had a colour and a vibrancy that I thought was a good thing for the town. And even though I'd come from a conservative background and a little bit wary of my background, I did embrace them, and felt they were a good thing for the artistic community here.
And Laurie spent some time here in the gallery.
Yes, he worked before my time with a former director as a gallery assistant. We've had different people who've either done volunteer work to gain experience or been paid employment. And Laurie Turner was one who worked for the former director for a brief time. Never very punctual with his timing here, so I was told, but he got into the spirit of that period. And I point out it wasn't necessarily a wild time, but it was more alternate for that period anyway.
And many of them were living in alternative ways in terms of not having power or not living in the bush.
They lived a lot of them in the bush, and they had modest means and didn't have a lot of wealth, but they enjoyed that time, irrespective of some of the hardships of lack of hot water in winter at times. But I don't think that worried them in any way, shape or form. But yeah, it was the spirit of the time.
And there was a very strong community amongst those people. They formed the Castlemaine Artists Co-op, which then became Castlemaine Artists Inc. And they had their own exhibitions. Did you ever go to any of those?
Yes, I was involved with the exhibitions. I was criticised for not supporting them enough through the public gallery here, but I did support them through acquisitions, through their co-ops. I used to go to the opening functions at that time. And I also, I got together socially with a lot of the artists who, as a collective body, I could see where they're trying to lift their profile professionally, and that was a positive thing. And I had seen over the 10 to 20 year period some of their work improve as a result of that camaraderie ship they had with fellow artists, being stimulated by a collective body.
How would you say Castlemaine has changed over the years that you've been here?
Yes, it has. I think the main changes that I've seen has been a new trend for Melbourne people who live on the northern suburbs of Melbourne. In the last 8 to 10 years, move out of the congestion of inner city living up to central Victoria, and particularly to Castlemaine and district, for a new lifestyle. These are families, couples with young children who may have got positions of work in the city that commute, and also we've got retirees, professional retirees who have sold up in Melbourne, who are living on the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, who have bought substantial residences in Castlemaine and wanted to embrace the local community and the quieter lifestyle. So there's been a combination I've seen over the last 10 years, which has brought what I call a new energy into the Castlemaine and district from both the younger families as well as the older professional retirees. And they've embraced U3A and social groups within the community, and it's not just what you'd term in the early days locals who are born and bred here. And that's, I think, a new energy is partly as a result of the Castlemaine State Festival. I firmly believe that that's had an impact every 2 years of having an arts festival in Castlemaine has encouraged people from Melbourne to move up to the area once they've experienced what we have to offer here.
I'd like to ask you about yourself in the early days. Which art school did you go to?
I went, first of all, after leaving school, I went to Brighton Tech to do what we call a preliminary diploma of art and design, and then to Caulfield Institute. Then I moved on up to Bendigo. I majored this is doing primary teaching, but majoring in art at that time.
Why did you choose art school? Were you an artist, a practicing
no,
artist?
well, I wasn't. My twin brother was. He went to Parantech, but I had more an interest in the history of art more than I admit. I wasn't a great practitioner. I knew I didn't have the abilities that like my brother did. So the focus was more on, from art school, more to potentially be a teacher. But I'd always had that wish to collect, and I'd been collecting art books and catalogues, Australian art catalogues from school days. So it sort of just evolved, I suppose, yeah. But I knew after my brother had won an art scholarship, and I used to look at his work and see the formal, practical side of painting, and go into artist studios as a young student as well. That gave me a real insight into how an artist, a visual artist, practices if they have a decent studio, and I was interested in the technical side of painting and the craft of painting, yeah, whatever the subject matter might have been.
Were your parents, your family interested in art?
They had some interest. I had a grandmother who really encouraged us to collect, and that's where the collecting hereditary does, I think, have a bearing. And my brother and I were collecting, some say were just out of our nappies, but it wasn't quite that early. But we collected at school from opportunity shops in Melbourne, buying and selling different prints at that stage. We didn't have a big budget. So it started off like that, but learning about the artists we'd collected as well. In 1928, the Queen Mother came out to Australia. She was in the Duchess of York. And of course, so much excitement in Castlemaine on a trip to Bendigo that she stopped at the railway station. And two businessmen commissioned James Quinn, who was living in London at that time, to paint the Duchess of York. And it's been much admired in 1931 when it was painted, and it was partly to commemorate the opening of the Castlemaine Art Gallery building, and it's been in the collection ever since. But it's a fine portrait. We think of the Queen Mother, even though she's been passed away over the last 4 or 5 years, you can still see that twinkle in her eye, even at that great age. She was over 100 when she passed away, but she was 31 years of age when she posed for this particular work. But one of the few portraits of the Queen Mother in an Australian public gallery collection. Yeah, this painting has been here for a long time. It was painted in 1916, and it's painted by Fred McCubbin's son, Louis McCubbin, who later became director of the Art Gallery of South Australia. But in his earlier years, he and a number of fellow artists used to travel from Melbourne on the train to Malmesbury and depicted a lot of the old mining remnants around Malmesbury and Castlemaine and Taradale and Chewton, where they camped in an old flour mill at Malmesbury and depicted some of the mining scene. This is called Hanover Mine at Malmesbury, of a German mine that were chasing gold in the earlier times and had fallen into disrepair. And it was an artistic subject for the artist to paint at that time.
Can we just talk a bit about the community of Castlemaine in terms of its appreciation of art? Because that goes over a long period of time. Do you want to talk about that history?
Yeah, well, the history of it, in the very early years, from my readings or learning about it, it is a working class town from its early beginnings, but the professional people that were in the town, like the doctors and solicitors and other professionals, they'd had that interest in art, and I have to say it really was a lot of the women of their time who, either through social connections, had that support and encouragement, like the Lavinis from Buda. But that period changed after the Second World War, and from the 50s and early 60s, when there was a new interest in Australian visual art, the community here seemed to grow more aware of it, and the community broadened its base. And it was not just people from working class backgrounds, but professionals and people that were just starting to show a greater interest in the arts, either collecting themselves or have seen art exhibitions on the gallery wall. And that community has remained strong, and I think because a number of professionals in the earlier days moved up to this Castlemaine and district, it encouraged others who could see that professional artists could live and work in this beautiful environment, but also sell their work through their agents in Melbourne or Sydney or Adelaide. And that's what I think brought further artists up to the region, because they liked the lifestyle, its proximity to Melbourne as a day destination. And all that had a sort of an impact, plus the train service. And that's why I think the landscape, the architecture, in its location, it's remained strong. And that's why I think it's had this consistent period of artistic community here.
And there have been other smaller galleries like the Wallace Brothers Gallery. Can you tell me a bit about?
Yes, well, that was a time it was quite unique for a regional town of this population of 7,000 to 7,500 to have a commercial gallery operating and to be able to survive commercially over that period of time. David and Peter Wallace, who had both trained as craftspeople, wanted to give their artist friends an opportunity to exhibit and sell their work. And as more people were visiting Castlemaine from Melbourne, people wanted something of the local artists here, not necessarily as a souvenir or a memento. It was more something more serious. And they could see that David and Peter were promoting the best of the local artists in their gallery, and it gave the opportunity for a lot of the ceramists as well as printmakers and painters an opportunity to show their work. And they were terrific openings with lively events and good sales, and people from Melbourne embraced that and often came up on a weekend for an opening and would buy something, because in those days when the Wallace Brothers Gallery was operating from I think the late 70s, the prices were still modest, in my opinion, and yeah, it created a new market for their work, which was terrific and unique for a country town of this size.
In those days, it was very affordable, a very affordable place for artists to live. That's one of the things that's changed. How do you see the impact on artists coming to Castlemaine or wanting to come to the area?
Okay, certainly, Catherine, the impact, you're quite right in saying that the impact with real estate has had an impact for more people moving up to the area. It has priced, the real estate market has priced a number of the local community out a little bit because of Melbourne people who have been able to sell in the eastern suburbs and have the funds to buy up here. For the artist, they've either had to be a bit, think outside the square and either live outside the centre of town, or construct a dwelling where they can use a home studio situation, and that's occurred in quite a few situations with artists who've moved here in recent times. But certainly it does have an impact. The real estate is high for its population here compared with other regional centres, but it's supply and demand, I suppose, and that's the way it has gone that way. But I think it's a downside for some of the locals who have been used to be able to afford a reasonable home in the township, where it's a bit more of a struggle these days.
Yes, I'm just wondering whether it might prevent more artists from being able to come here.
No, I don't think so. I think for some there might be, but I believe even though economic hard times are upon us, I think those who have established themselves in the capital city or elsewhere still could afford to live in this region satisfactorily, because there are advantages and costs can be kept down compared with living in the city. So I don't think it's going to be a deterrent. I think because the arts are such a strong, vibrant community in Castlemaine and district, I think it's going to continue. I really do, yeah.
Why, as human beings, do we need art and artists?
Well, as human beings, I always think back to when the gallery was established, where the foundation members had a war cry. Bear in mind it was just before the First World War, and their strength was, and I quote, "No art, no culture, no nation." Art is essential for, I've always maintained this, for the well-being of the human spirit and soul. It provides not only stimulus for thinking about life and the world around us, but it's an essential, I see it as an essential part of life. And without it, people are the poorer of it, I suppose, and that's in a simplistic way. But art over the centuries has been important for society, some more than others, but it's critical, particularly in Australia with a young country of only 200 odd years of age, to have this stimulus to broaden our well-being in life. Yeah, I think that's what I would deem why we need it.
You're finishing in the gallery soon, end of the year.
Yep.
What have you still got to do before you leave?
Well, I've got a book. My last book through the gallery is a book on the history of the Castlemaine Art Gallery to mark our centenary in October this year, and some major acquisitions which we hope to be announcing during the October, the actual 100 years of the centenary. I've secured some significant acquisitions either through gift or purchase, and I wanted to, over all these years, finish on a bit of a high more than a low, and I've secured the Arts Minister of Victoria to launch this, my last book on the history of the gallery, which will complete 100-year history of Castlemaine Art Gallery.
Wonderful. It's been lovely talking with you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.